I want to start this review a little differently because sometimes when I put out these videos, I forget that sometimes the people I'm talking about might be watching them, and that's what happened with my previous video for the Flotsam and Jetsam album for Drift. And it was bass player Jason Ward who watched my video, and he left a comment. So he brought up something important. So I'm going to read his comment, just the way he wrote it, and I want to talk about a few stuff. So Jason wrote, and you can find his comment on the previous video. He said, "I like your reviews of my era, but you overlook something very important aspect to what happened on the writing of the album Drift. When I started the Quattro tour, I think we might have been a week into the tour, I got the call that my brother Jeff Ward, drummer from Ministry, Nine Inch Nails, Lord, Revolting Cocks, had killed himself. So not only was the world changing, so were our lives, mine in particular. My input certainly made the album dark. Ed Carlson was also battling his own demons. It would have been impossible for us to create anything than what we did. So yes, a cataclysmic event for me led me to write a much darker side. Songs like Me, Empty Air Missing, Smoked Out, 12-Year-Old, Poet's Tale carry that darkness on its sleeve. JC, if you want material for these reviews of the records I appear on, feel free to reach out. I'm currently writing a book on my years with Flotsam and the years leading up to my brother's departure from this world." So that's really important because really cool of him to offer to help out. And I also enjoy when artists leave comments on my videos because I try to keep things as accurate as I can, but sometimes it's not that easy because I just go with what I read online, on forums, on different pages and all that. So it's good to hear that he is bringing this to my attention. So I'm actually going to address this because one of the songs on this next album, High, is dedicated to his brother. So I will be talking about that. So let me now just go into just the official video where I talk about the next album called High. So let's do that right now. What happens when a band that spent years trying to break into the mainstream finally realizes that the mainstream may not want them anymore? By 1997, Flotsam and Jetsam had already survived more changes than most bands ever experienced. They had lost Jason Newsted to Metallica. They had moved from Metal Blade to Elektra and then to MCA. They had experimented with their sound on albums like Quattro and Drift. And now, after years of trying to find their place in a changing music industry, they were back where it all started, Metal Blade Records. But this time, Flotsam and Jetsam weren't the young thrash band that had released Doomsday for Deceiver in 1986. They were older, more experienced, and musically very different. And the new album would be called High. Released in June 1997, High was the band's sixth studio album and the first release for Metal Blade since Doomsday for the Deceiver. It also marked the third consecutive album with the same lineup. Eric A.K. on vocals, Ed Carlson and Michael Gilbert on guitars, Jason Ward on bass, and Kelly David Smith on drums. For a band that had gone through so many personal changes earlier in its career, that stability was significant. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last. The story of High really begins with Drift. Flotsam and Jetsam had spent 3 albums with MCA, but by the middle of the 1990s, the relationship had run its course. The musical landscape had changed dramatically. Grunge had taken over the mainstream rock, metal's presence on radio and MTV was shrinking, and bands that once seemed like future superstars were suddenly struggling to find an audience. Flotsam and Jetsam were one of those bands. After Drift failed to achieve the commercial impact the MCA had hoped for, the band and the label parted ways, and Flotsam returned to Metal Blade. There was something almost symbolic about it. The band was going back to the label that had believed in them when they were teenagers playing aggressive Arizona thrash. But now the industry around them was completely different. There was no realistic expectation that High was going to turn Flotsam and Jetsam into the next Metallica. Instead, the band could concentrate on just being Flotsam and Jetsam, and that gave High a somewhat different identity. I'm wondering who they're chasing. Musically, High continued the evolution that had begun with Quattro and Drift. This wasn't a return to Doomsday for the Deceiver. There were still thrash elements, but the band was increasingly interested in groove, melody, hard rock, and heavier, slower passages. The The guitars could be aggressive, but they were often less frantic than they had been a decade earlier. And lyrically, there was a darker side to the album. Politics and society remained important subjects for the band, continuing a trend that had appeared on their previous records. But High could also be strange, sarcastic, and occasionally surreal. Songs like The Final Step, Hallucinational, It's on Me, Your Hands, and Monster showed a band that wasn't interested in simply recreating the past. Monster in particular became the album's most visible song. Flotsam and Jetsam made a video for it, giving the record one of its main promotional tools. The song itself dealt with darker imagery and the feeling of becoming something ugly in response to the world around you. And then there were songs like High Noon and Lucky Day, which showed just how far the band had moved away from straightforward 1980s thrash. Lucky Day was one of my favorites. It had these jazzy tones incorporated into the thrash sound, so let me play a clip of that. There was still plenty of metal here, but it was 1997. Flotsam and Jetsam were making an album for the world they actually lived in, not the world that had existed when Doomsday came out. Then there was Fork Boy. At first, it might seem like an odd choice. The song was originally recorded by Lard, the industrial punk band formed by Jello Biafra of Dead Kennedys and members of Ministry. Flotsam version appeared as the final track on High, but there was a much deeper reason for its inclusion. Fork Boy was dedicated to Jeff Ward, the older brother of Flotsam bassist Jason Ward. Jeff was himself a drummer who had played with several important alternative and industrial bands, including Nine Inch Nails, Ministry, Revolting Cocks, and Lard. He died in 1993 after struggling with heroin addiction and taking his own life. So when Flotsam and Jetsam recorded Fork Boy, it wasn't simply a band covering a song they liked. It was a tribute. The connection made the track especially meaningful because Jeff Ward had actually been part of the musical world from which the song came. It gave the closing track on High an emotional weight that wasn't immediately obvious just from looking at the track listing. And also showed another side of Jason Ward, who had joined Flotsam before Quattro and had now become an important part of the band's identity. One of the interesting things about High is how much ground Flotsam and Jetsam cover in just 11 tracks. Final Step opens the album with a long, aggressive piece that immediately reminds listeners that this is still a metal band. Hallucinational picks up the pace. Your Hands brings more melody and groove. Monster became the obvious promotional centerpiece. Toast is another aggressive moment, while Everything closed the main body of the album with the run of records' longer tracks. And then there is the title track, High. The album wasn't afraid to move between styles. This was both its strength and, for some listeners, its weakness. Some fans appreciated the fact that Flotsam continued to evolve. Others wanted to return to the intensity of its first two records. That division would become important when High was received by critics and fans.
Again, it's just me.
The reception to High was mixed. Some listeners found it an underrated record that revealed more of its strengths after repeated listens. One retrospective review, for example, describes initially disliking the album before eventually coming to appreciate its heavy metal character dynamics, guitar solos, and Eric A.K.'s distinctive vocals. But other reviews were considerably harsher. Critics pointed to what they considered weaker songwriting, a less impressive production than the band's previous two albums, and a shift towards slower, groove-oriented material. And that tells us something important about where Flotsam and Jetsam were in 1997. They weren't making Doomsday for the Deceiver again. They weren't trying to recreate No Place for Disgrace, and they weren't even completely repeating Quattro or Drift. They were continuing to change. The problem was that the metal audience of the late 1990s wasn't necessarily rewarding bands for changing, and Flotsam and Jetsam were still trying to find an audience in an industry that had largely moved on. Commercially, High didn't reverse their fortunes, but creatively, it was another chapter in the band's refusal to stand still. There's another important reason High matters for the history of Flotsam and Jetsam. It was the final album for guitarist Michael Gilbert and drummer Kelly David Smith before they both left the band. That made High the third and final album to feature this particular five-man lineup, which included Eric A.K, Ed Carlson, Michael Gilbert, Jason Ward, Kelly David Smith. The lineup has survived Quattro, Drift, and now High. But after the album, it was over. Gilbert had been with the band since the mid-'80s. Kelly David Smith had been there even longer, making his departure particularly significant. and once again Flotsam and Jetsam had to rebuild. Michael Gilbert is going to eventually return to the band many years later, but in 1997, his departure represented the end of another era. Kelly David Smith was also leaving after an extraordinary run. The band now needed a new guitarist, and they needed a new drummer. Replacements would be Mark Simpson and Craig Nielsen. According to accounts of the period, Megadeth drummer Nick Menza was involved in recommending Nielsen to the band. Suddenly, the band that had finally managed to keep the same lineup together for 3 albums was starting over again. Had brought one era of Flotsam and Jetsam to an end. Michael Gilbert was gone, Kelly David Smith was gone. After 3 albums with the same lineup, the band once again had to figure out who would stand behind Eric A.K, Ed Carlson, and Jason Ward. But the story wasn't over, far from it. For the next chapter, Flotsam and Jetsam would bring in 2 new members, guitarist Mark Simpson and drummer Craig Nielsen. And with this new lineup, the band would enter the next phase of its career. The year would be 1999. The album would be called A Natural Selection, and once again, Flotsam and Jetsam would find themselves trying to adapt to a changing metal landscape. The question was whether these 2 new members could help the band regain the chemistry it had developed over the previous 3 albums. Would A Natural Selection build on the darker, heavy direction of High? Would Flotsam and Jetsam return to their thrash roots? Or would they continue searching for a sound that could carry them into a new decade? There was also another major question. After years of lineup changes, could this new version of Flotsam and Jetsam finally establish some stability? The answer would come with A Natural Selection, 2 new members, a new chapter, and another attempt by Flotsam to survive in a meta world that was changing faster than ever. So that will be next episode, and I will probably get that done sometime next week. So, thanks for watching, and check out the playlist. It should be appearing on the screen right now, and I have a lot more to come. And I'm doing this up until the new album. If I don't get finished before the new album, I'll probably just review the new album and then I'll just go back and cover everything. So once I start a series, I need to complete it in full. So anyway, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.